Exact day. But I do remember that I was supposed to fly there the night before, and it was the night that Trump issued that travel restriction. So I didn't get on the plane. Yeah. But I was happy it wasn't in the air.
Did you ever see the show in person yourself, or did you?
No, I haven't seen it. No.
Oh my God.
I've only seen images. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the first time that we're actually in the same boat.
Yeah, exactly. I also have not had a chance to see it, but I hope that I'll get to see it, before it goes down, but we'll see.
Yeah, so, I mean, these are pretty new to me. I think I've only seen one of these sculptural works in person before, and that might have been at an art fair or something, not an exhibition. Can you tell me a little bit more about them? It looks like each one is like a specific pairing of like mineral and glass.
Yeah, I started making these when I was pregnant with Eden. So
congratulations, by the way.
Thanks. About 1.5 years ago. And they came from something really very straightforward, which is actually when I was thinking about getting pregnant, I learned about biology in a new but extremely obvious way, which is simply that it takes 1 millisecond for sperm to create an embryo and an egg. But eggs, which are obviously what's inside my body, you're born with as a baby. And that means that half of Eden was actually inside of my mom's body. It's a weird thought, but it's true. And so this Russian doll embryo, I was just thinking about the depth of time involved in making a body. And if half of Eden started in my mom before, or when I was being formed inside my mom, Eden was being formed inside me, how do you decide when life begins? And so, these works were just the fusing in a very simple way of two different states of time in one material. So the rocks come obviously from thousands of years it takes to form. And then glass, I worked with glass blower Andrew Hughes, forms instantly on the rocks and when we're melding them together. And both are made of the same material. I mean, you're a sculptor, glass is sand and sand is rock. So I was interested in how to image these two different states of time that were very viscerally happening inside of me and happen for the formation of all of our bodies, and bring into light how indeterminate it is when life begins.
They're really beautiful. So this is what is this?
I have a list of what all these minerals are. I don't remember exactly what that is, but I have it. It's written down somewhere.
We're going to put it on the screen in post.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
But it just looks, it looks like glass itself. So it's kind of incredible to see that pairing in conjunction with some of these other more distinctly kind of mineral formations where it has that sense of a geode, or it has something that looks much more like an egg. It's also really interesting to see, even though they're completely dry, everything here feels very wet. It feels like it's kind of underwater.
I mean, the thing I was most excited about in making these was these points where the glass and the rock meet. Because that's the thing that's actually so precarious and delicate when you're working with blown glass on a pre-existing hard material, especially when that hard material is actually quite delicate, as rocks are. They can quickly break and heat. Right. I was for many of these, we did many versions and arrived at the ones that we did, in part because that the joining is what I was interested in, how these two materials meet. One of the things I was thinking about with the show started in in Castle. And I was thinking about there with the curator, Syme, and with Moritz, the director, about expansion and compression of space. And so in Sitting, Feeding, Sleeping, we took what's a normal sized room and built a smaller room. And I think a viewer can't really stand, or you could stand there, but you can see that the ceiling's been angled down. Yeah.
Oh, right.
And so, and obviously the screen is in a kind of window wall located down to the ground. So when you come in to see that work, you're invited to sit down. It's an intimate work. The voiceover is my voice. It's all footage I shot. It's the first video I ever made. So I really wanted the space to feel intimate. And then when you go into Lake Valley, it's like this animated dreamscape of this chimeric animal. And so the room is shrouded in double layers of scrim on here. And that creates a kind of moire effect, which is not so visible in this one photograph, but so kind of like shimmering of light. And then the screen is actually like outsized to the scale of a person. It's really big. And this is a double height room. And so, yeah, so there's like, if you were to move through the space, you would get this intimate and then this expansive feeling between the two.
And this is, I mean, these layers of transparency, that's something that you've worked with before. It immediately makes me think of your video installation at the Whitney Museum, where you showed everything and more.
Yeah. It's a bit different in this case because there's no natural light. Yeah, in this version, it's surrounded by windows. In the version of Lake Valley, I was, I guess, thinking about utilizing that screen because the film itself is made through plates. So, I mean, not literal, just Photoshop, but Photoshop follows the same model of plate animation where you do one thing on one plate, another on another, and it builds up like that. Mm-hmm. And so I liked, in some ways, that the screen mimics that. Like there are dimensions to the physical screen.
I see. So yeah, this is, in a sense, like I'm just trying to... There's always like a physical realization of the way that you're thinking about video. Like it's never just simply video projection.
Yeah. I mean, I try to think of how to use the space and how you're going to see a work to bring out something about the work itself, because otherwise it's a missed opportunity, and why show it in this kind of context? So I definitely try to think about that every time with the work. So like in this case, yeah, like I said, yeah, I was thinking about it.
And this is, I mean, I'm kind of surprised at how well the video comes through in this. Like, I remember at the Whitney, the back window was open, which allowed like a relative amount of light to come through. But this is almost feels more like a hallucination now.
Yeah, that's a cool way to put it. Yeah, well, this, we were using an LED screen in the Whitney. It was just projection. Right. But here, because it's an LED screen, you can actually have this full lit space. And that was the first time I've done something like that. And yeah, I wish I could see it in person. Because, yeah, but it does the same thing that we were experimenting with at the Whitney, which is that the blacks in the image become translucent and the colors in the image remain opaque. So it continues that. Yeah, it has a more ephemeral quality here. I think you're right, like an hallucination or something. It feels like it's just floating. And I really like how the reflections in the glass are, because it feels like you can't, like, where is it? It could be all around you or something.
I want to show a little bit of that video. Start at 40. So we'll just start here.
When I first came back to Earth.
So of course you can't hear this right now, but this is when the astronaut is starting his conversation about coming back to Earth.
Just walking, I took a few steps off the spacecraft and then decided to go ahead and lay down on the stretcher and be carried away because gravity felt so heavy. My wristwatch felt like a bowling ball on my arm. The weight of your body is overwhelming.
These transitions are really, really sumptuous, and I think it's something that I wanted to focus on for a moment because I think it kind of segs well with the egg pieces and how I've just been thinking about sort of the watery nature of a lot of your work, or in a sense, like, I'm kind of curious how you think about the cut. Because of course, like, you have standard cuts throughout your pieces, but especially in this piece where you're transitioning through all these kind of liquid barriers and motifs of like smearing and swiping and washing away, it seems like rather than like just a categorical cut, it's almost more like a mutation or like a transformation. And I was wondering if like that's something that you think about, or if is it just internal to the work?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. I thought about that consciously when I was making everything and more. I think about the edit in my works differently each time, depending on what I'm trying to bring out. And in everything more, I really wanted it to be as cut-free as possible. So it was really developed, the transitions are really developed through compositing. So like if you keep playing, just going forward 1 second. Let's see.
I can also, there's maybe another moment.
Yeah, like this. Like instead of cutting between these two different shots, they're composited together. So one shot kind of is pushing through the next, and then this pushes into the astronaut's suit. And yeah, I was thinking about this kind of void-like state that the body is in outer space. And maybe it's connected to degrounding, taking away from Earth, a shift in sense perception that's so rooted in evolution and gravity of the Earth. So I think, I was thinking about that when I was taking away as much as I could from cutting in this work.
And do you think it's like is it kind of like this organic back and forth? Because I feel like there's a fair amount of research that goes into the works that you're making, and specifically like in this particular case, it's about an astronaut going to space and coming back, and like the confronting that kind of nothingness. But then at the same time, you seem very in tune with the emotional space as well, and like how you can register that in the body, kind of outside of like an idea and more of like an enveloping feeling. Like, sorry, go ahead.
No, what were you going to say?
I'm just kind of curious more about process. Like, is there a point in which you have a structure and then you just start seeing where things take you? Or is it, do you have like this growing sense of how things come to be?
So it's really pretty different in each of my works depending on what I'm trying to do. So in Everything and More, I had to propose to University of Maryland. Oh, near you. That's where I shot this. University of Maryland. Why I was doing it, what I was trying to do. And the same thing with working with David Wolf, the astronaut who I interviewed. And so I had a relatively clear idea of what I was planning. But of course, after I interviewed David, then the process of editing down that interview, which was maybe a 2-hour interview that's edited into 10 minutes. So then that became a script for when I was shooting at University of Maryland. I was thinking about that, and then working with the materials in my kitchen, I was thinking about that and in a way illustrating or playing off of his words. So that's like maybe the least structured way in which I've approached a video, which is that I knew what materials I needed to get. I went out and got the materials. I had an idea of how I was going to assemble it. And then really in the edit, that was a process of really understanding what I was trying to do. That's completely different than, for example, Lake Valley, in which I had to write, storyboard, and put together an animatic before I worked with the animation studio and the animator I ended up working with, because all of that cost, I mean, every frame cost money, and there's no room when I was making Lake Valley to make something and go, oh no, I didn't like it, I'm going to change it. That's not how the cost of doing hand-drawn, handmade animation like that works. So in that case, it was just fleshed out, and then we made it, and then I spent time while we were making it experimenting with sound and what I wanted the kind of folly texture to be, but I didn't have that opportunity with that. And the same thing is largely true for Will-O-Wisp, because when I made Will-O-Wisp, because I was shooting on at this historical living history museum again, and because I was working with a crew and actors and production design to set this period, it had to be written and storyboarded before I went in. But there was lots of re-editing afterwards. Yeah.
Does that, I mean, to me, that almost feels like a shift in kind of working as an artist versus working as a director, which obviously, like, I'm making a very, like, arbitrary distinction. Right. Like, of course, they're the same thing, but how do those two processes feel to you in terms of, like, how it motivates you?
Well, I think it's almost a kind of trade-off that as a maker, I feel like we all have to weigh. Like the trade-off for getting to shoot a period piece is that you have to have an idea of what you're going to do before you do it. You know, like it's like you don't get to do a period piece unless you also have a grounded place that everyone can refer to if you're working with a larger crew. So I think there's that, you know, when I made A Minute Ago, for example, which is not included in this show, the work I shot at the Glass House, I knew I wanted to do something at the Glass House. I knew that I was interested in the history of modernist architecture and how that affected our sense of our own mortality after Hurricane Sandy. That's where that came from. But
slip.
Yeah. Infected. Well, it's true. But I didn't have really, honestly, more ideas than that. And then I was going to go shoot at the Glass House, and I was like, shoot, I have to have like a reason and a way that I'm shooting there. And I had found this old video of Philip Johnson giving a tour of the Glass House. And I thought, okay, I will replicate that tour just without his body, and then I'll composite him back in. From there, then I started thinking about the history of compositing in film and collage and trauma and et cetera, and then learning more about the Glass House. And then the video came together, but that was possible because the only thing required to shoot at the Glass House was me plus a camera. It wasn't, I mean, them allowing me to do it. I think I was there for 2 hours, but there was everything else was just done on my computer by myself. And so, I guess, yeah, where I'm going, that's possible if that's the scale that you want to work at. That like lack of predetermining what you're doing. I mean, I'm sure you must have this with sculpture, the same exact thing, right? I mean, with fabrication, with working with other people, there's only so far you can go without.
Yeah, there's different levels of planning that are required. Like if you're deciding to take on a more directorial capacity.
Right.
So it's, I think there is some similarities. There's definitely trade-offs, but sometimes there's no other way to do it.
Right.
So if you have a period piece in mind, then how else could you do it without the help of others?
Right. Yeah, or like if you want to, I mean, for me, it was like making Will-O-Wisp was so much about like trying to understand how people saw the world in this other time. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it just felt like the most fun sensorial way to do that would be to do a period piece.
So I want to play a couple of clips from this, because like this one, like it's, I think part of like me talking about like how so much of the work I noticed this kind of wetness or like a liquidity to it. It feels like there's a shift in this particular piece where it actually feels quite dry, like not the content itself, like it's not like a dry watch, but it's arid, like the air feels dry and everything about it feels dry, and like fire tends to be like the most pronounced element. Yeah, it's almost elemental. Like I feel like elementally, like you've been working with like wind and water, and now this feels more like fire and earth. And I just want to play this one, like a couple of scenes, because also there's a lot of mysteries in this piece for me. So there's like this weird, like almost like a resonant fabric that kind of comes into focus. I guess I should give some background as to what we're watching here. This is a story of a woman named Elspeth, kind of in 15th century or 16th century England, during a moment when land is being privatized, and it becomes this like moment to think about witchcraft and health and like how some practices start to fall by the wayside while others come into focus. And it's tackling a lot, but it does it in a very short, almost like moral fable kind of way. And I just I wanted to show that initial scene just to give a sense of some of the like kind of visualizations that are happening, but there's a recurring motif here where there's like this screen and Elspeth gathering something, and the screen becomes like this way of I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, like of pushing the story forward in a way, but also collapsing different kinds of time. Can you tell me a little bit about that screen?
Yeah, okay, so actually, can we go to the very beginning of the film to talk about that screen? Okay, yeah. Go to the very beginning for a second. I can't do it.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so initially I had this idea about the screen, which was just because people saw nature from such an animist perspective. Mm-hmm. I was like, well, why don't we image nature as like totally non-nature, this other thing? So here, if you go back to that shot, what we did is we literally set the screen up outside the door of this house. That's a projection screen with a projection of a painting on it right there. Right. So it's like you're in one world, and then like the outside world is like this fantastical other thing. So initially I got the screen there because I thought that's what I was going to do with it solely, is I was just going to basically wrap all the scenes in the interior of the house with this projected landscape.
I see.
And then we were shooting, and we had finished shooting at like 1 a.m. that night. And we actually had a whole like disaster with the screen that day. And anyway, and I was like, let's just shoot her in front of the screen. I have no idea why. Let's just do it. Let's just see what we can do. We were shooting a shot for something else. And it was 1 a.m. and it took us like an hour to set the screen up. And then it was like 2 a.m. and it was freezing because we shot this in March or February in Massachusetts. I mean, it was just like freezing cold. And so yeah, we just shot her against this screen because we had the screen there, and I had no ideas other than the original idea. Yeah. And then I wasn't going to use it or anything. I just had it. And then when I wrote one story, which is how we shot it. And then it actually felt, which was this fable that I kind of made up as this amalgamation of different women that I had read about. And then we shot it, and then I was editing it, and it just felt so flat and so didactic. And so I started trying to come up with ways to make the story function a bit more like the way that I imagined the world. And so I started playing with that footage that we had from the screen and compositing, as you see in the film.
Okay.
But it was really just as a kind of like stitch to the problem of the story, which is exactly sort of how you read it. But yeah.
That's really, I mean, that's really funny to know. It's, there's a moment when she's actually like healing someone where, this right here, like the bird comes in, everything feels very hard to pin down in terms of like whether this is actually happening, whether this is like a fiction. And then we keep going back to that scene of her in front of the screen. It feels super loaded. I mean, the one thing that I've been thinking about is this idea of gathering, and like her gathering in front of the image, and like also how you're using the screen to gather imagery in a sense that like everything's overlaid on top of one another, and like there's all these different ways in which history is being compressed and stretched and retold, and that there's also this understanding of like cinema as both public and private, and like a different kind of gathering. So like that's kind of where my head has been when I've been thinking about it a little bit more. But
I think one of the things that was so central to some ways that people thought about healing during the time was death transference. So the idea that like an animal would die and their death would enable the life to come back to a person, or a person would temporarily die because an animal was killed and that animal could hold their soul, and then the soul was brought back. This kind of like transference of souls between bodies. And so that's what I had researched at the time, like different healing practices and ceremonies, and that guy is supposed to be dead, and then she brings him back to life, and something about this dove flying into the attic and it dying, and then this deer that she's experienced in the tree in the woods. I was trying to kind of bring that all together, even if it's not clear. That's what I was thinking about there. Yeah.
Because there's the immediate story, which is narrated, where people believe that she's come back as this cow. And so there's like this cow in the middle of the field, which I can't tell if it's real or if it's like digitally placed. Like it has a really unreal
It's
quality.
digitally placed.
Okay.
And those two shots are like sutured together too. Those two shots, like where you're like spanning. Yeah.
In fact, like that barn scene, like I think
it's a real cow. Actually, it's a real cow. It's just fake put there.
Where is that barn scene? Is it like at the very beginning? Well, I know it's at the end. Yeah. Is this also a rendering?
All of this is real. This is the historical museum that we shot at. The moss is fake. The cow is fake. And I don't know. And the sun is fake. Yeah.
Because it has, it has this very surreal quality, and everything. I feel like the way that some of these images come together, it takes its beauty from that surreal space where. It's not necessarily about like finding what's real and what's fake. It's just something that we can talk about right now. But it gives a very particular like texture and temperature to the video piece, which I really like.
Right. I mean, the other thing that makes it feel illustrated, I guess, is the anamorphic lens that we were working with. So you can see like how these trees up here or here. Right. Everything kind of feels a little bit warped. That's also just because of the nature of the lens. But yeah, I mean, before you were noting the kind of moire effect that happens during the fire.
Right.
And that is actually something that developed in relationship to the installation that started at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where the walls were where I created the walls as these double scrims to create this kind of moire effect, which is what I then worked with again in the Lafayette show where Lake Valley is. But that was a way of kind of bringing in the way that as a viewer you'd experience the room into how you're seeing the work.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah. So it decontextualized, it makes a little bit less sense.
It just makes a different sense. Like it feels like it gives kind of in the way that in Everything and More there's this it feels like, it like in a very general sense, like everything is connected, like that it has this both like local and cosmic sensibility to it, and having that kind of moire effect also gives you the sense that there's a sense of like the invisible, something that's invisible that's activating the visible.
Yeah.
And I guess that I wanted to know how you, I mean, in a very general sense, like how you think about sort of the unconscious in the way that you start thinking about these videos. Like I know that, of course, there's a lot of historical basis to them, but is the unconscious, or is like developing something from like a intuitive state of mind also part of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I try to access that and let myself be in that as much as I can when I'm working on something, which I find really difficult, actually. But I think that one of the things that artworks can offer is they can be like a shared dream, like a way of, like when we see an artwork together, or like the artist and the audience together can like be in a dream through the artwork. So yeah, I really try to think about that. And often in my works, when I get stuck in a kind of rational perspective on how I'm making it, because there's like this whole attitude, for making sculpture that you have to embody, which is like the attitude of the producer, where you're like, I'm going to get this done, and I have this goal, and this is the way we're going to do it, and then we're going to shoot here, and then I'm going to assemble it this way, which is like this rational perspective. And then usually like partially through editing, I have to figure out a way to turn that off. And often I try to come up with this, like a word, and I'll just try to repeat that word to myself every time I sit down to work and while I'm working. And they can be like very dumb words, but whatever it is, to try to orientate myself towards moving to something more subliminal in the way that I'm working, because otherwise, what's the point?
What's the last word that you remember?
Yeah. Well, the most recent work I made, which is a work called Enclosure, which is not in this show, which is also set in 17th century England. I was using a very straightforward word when I was editing it, which is magic. And I was trying to think at all times about how to induce magic into the work. So one way that ended up manifesting is in the sound. I got really interested in this Japanese composer named Takemitsu's work, because he did work with largely percussive sounds, and using things like metal and stone and water, mixing things, raw materials together to produce sound. And so I started thinking about percussion as alchemy, and so sound as magic. And so then I kind of let the score, which is like inspired by Takemitsu, very percussive, and rooted in acoustic natural materials, guide editing more magic into the work.
Oh, that's really nice.
Yeah. So yeah, different works have different like things. Like I remember in Everything When More, I was thinking about like fluidity and no cuts, but I was also thinking about repetition. Like the film keeps coming back to this one camera movement between the water and the astronaut suit, back and forth, back and forth. Right. And then I was thinking about these repeated patterns between things. So yeah, I don't know. Do you do that with your work? Or you like a word and then you like zoom towards the word?
I've never done that before, but I really, really like the sound of it. It's more, I'll have like an album playing over and over and over. So I'll have like these headphones, and then I'll just have like the same album to kind of induce the headspace that I know that I need for that particular thing. But yeah, I mean, I guess in a way it's like, they both seem like different ways of holding a mantra in a way. Like something to focus a kind of resonance, whatever that may be.
Yeah, I mean, it can be like very hard, I think, to slip into that dream state when you're working on a work, especially when you're involved in the planning so much. Yeah. But it's so necessary.
It also feels like, in terms of your larger ambitions for what the work is trying to touch, thinking about mortality, thinking about death, thinking about how humans move from stories to speak of these things, it feels so ineffable that, in a sense, like just being able to dream about those things or think about those things might also just help putting you in that state. Like, how could you not somehow like drift into that state when you're talking about such unknowable things?
That's nice. Yeah, I've been reading this book. I have it here, The Denial of Death. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, no, thinking about, obviously creating things and consuming things is also how we deny the fact that we're going to die. Yeah.
So
connected.
Yeah, before, kind of to wrap up, there's two questions that I ask everybody. The first is, have you ever had a transcendent experience with a work of art?
Definitely. 100%. Yes. Yes. But so many different artworks and so many different films and so many different pieces of music. I read this Joyce Carol Oates story the other day. It's a short story. It's called Feral. And it's about this mom who moves, strangely, an hour outside of New York on the Hudson River, which is where I am right now. And she has this child, and the child is like a Buddha baby, and everyone's obsessed with him. And his name is Derek, and she calls him Derry, and he's perfect, and she loves him. And one day they're in the pool, and like the public pool, and he drowns. And they take him to the ER, and it's like, is he going to make it? And he barely makes it. Anyway, he comes back to life, basically. And when he comes back to life, he's like a terror child. He becomes super evil, feral. Like, part of this whole genre, like Rosemary's Baby, of like the violent child that is the devil or something. And she's like, what happened? And she blames herself and all this stuff. And every day he starts like running away, going to the woods. She takes him to therapy. She's trying to fix the problem. He's like constantly drawn to the woods. One day they're driving back from therapy, and he's like a 6 or 7 year old. He's like a child. And he runs out of the car and he runs through the woods, and she starts running through the woods chasing him. And so far the whole story is told in this really like succinct way. Like, the language isn't flowery. It's just boom, 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 boom. And they get to this lake. She's running after him, and the kid is running, and she loses sight of him, and she gets to this lake, and the language just explodes. It's like she describes every ripple of the water and the moonlight and the trees and the wind and the sound of the foxes. And like, it just is like this fantasy zone she goes into, like complete sublime landscape thing. And then she spots her child across the rippling water, and he's howling with a bunch of other children.
Wow.
And that was transcendent. When I read that, I was like, damn.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's the best. That's the most transcendent experience I've had with art recently.
Okay, that's great. Wow. Okay, I'm going to read that story.
Yeah, it's called Feral.
Okay. And the second question is, how has the idea of being an artist changed for you from when you started to now?
Oh, that's a good question. How is the idea of being an artist? So, like, what I think about art, how's the idea of being an artist? I think I've always thought that being an artist is a really good excuse to learn and experiment and try to unfold interior feelings that are shared. I think I've always felt that. I think that now I've been thinking a lot about artists' authority, I guess, because it feels like, in some ways, what's the purpose of an artist? I mean, I know we've been talking about an artist can supply this unconscious shared space, but I guess, like, what's the skill that an artist can bring? And I feel like one of the skills that an artist can bring is being unafraid to learn, because so many people in their professions learn the thing that they need to learn within their profession, but then they feel self-conscious or not confident or afraid to learn from another profession or from another place. And I think one skill an artist can bring today is learning from many different places and synthesizing and growing something from that. So operating as a kind of petri dish through not being afraid to learn.
Yeah, that's really nice. I have very similar feelings about that, just in terms of like an artist. To me, an artist felt like someone who has to learn as many tongues as possible, and like speaking all those languages, and in a sense like being able to translate in a number of different ways, and letting all that kind of synthesize together is something that's really important. And you're right, it's difficult for people to keep jumping into new territory, because it's all these risks and failures that are associated with it.
Yeah, it feels like that's what artists can offer other people too, like that openness or something. Like hopefully everyone could be an artist.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of openness in your work, even if the story is very specific. So I think that's why a lot of people connect with it.
Yeah. Cool. Ajay, thank you for such like thoughtful, considered, deep questions. Thank you.
Oh no, it's been my pleasure. So I have a passage that I've selected for you that I think is kind of keeping in tone with your work. It's a passage from Maurice Sendak's last book that was dedicated to his brother. So I'm starting it kind of in the middle, but it's basically about two brothers who have been separated, and this is the moment of like them sort of finding their way. A boy in winter fell deep in ice, and his dear nose froze. Deep roots became his living toes. For 5 long years he lay so sunk, till bark enclosed his living trunk. Bare vines entwined his glittering head. Ask of the wild cherry tree, does he live? Is he dead?
That's good.
And Guy sank up a couch of flowers in a ice-ribbed underworld, awash in blossoming gold from a new sun tumbling out dark long-ago clouds. Its caverns and corridors paved with painted petals wound round a wild cherry tree dusted pink. Guy saw Jack's nose and rooted toes, deep buried in veiled blossoms, and he bit that nose to be sure. Just lost when I am saved, Jack sighed, and his arms, as branches will, wound round his noble-hearted brother, who he loves more than his own self. And Jack slept safe, enfolded in his brother's arms, and Guy whispered, "Good night, and you will dream of me."
I'm going to get that book. Thank you, Ajay. It's
very
really
welcome.
Good. Thank you.
Rachel, thanks so much for doing this. I know that
Thanks
it's
so much
very,
for having
very
me.
busy being a new mom and just everything that's going on. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye. Okay, bye.